My grandmother left me $28 million and a house. The two people who once signed me away for $13,000 came back to take it. That isn't a headline. That's the day I'm sitting in right now. I'm still in the black dress from Gloria Rowe's funeral, in her attorney's office, with flower scent dried into the fabric. The room feels like a courtroom disguised as a conference room. Heavy walnut table, blinds half closed, late light cut into sharp bars. My hands stay flat on the table so they don't shake. Martin Hale has been my grandmother's lawyer for more than 20 years. He explains everything the way surgeons talk about bone. All personal accounts transfer to me. Her controlling interest in Rowe Heritage Properties transfers to me. The farmhouse where I actually grew up transfers to me, officially. He says the total estate is valued at roughly $28 million. The number doesn't feel like winning. It feels like standing alone at the front of a line I never asked to lead. My grandmother warned me this would happen. Money doesn't change people, she said. It shows them. She said the ones who left would come back the moment ink dried. The door behind me opens, and my body knows before my mind does. My shoulders lock, my stomach tightens fast. I recognize those footsteps from a smaller version of me, 8 years old, trying to understand why the car pulled away without looking back. I don't turn. I don't offer them the word family. They let go of that word. This is not grief for them. This is an extraction. Across the table, Martin reaches for the small black recorder he kept aside. My grandmother didn't only leave money. She left proof. And before we go on, tell me where you are, and what time it is as you hear this. I want to know how far my story can reach, and how many of you will stay until the truth plays out. The air in that room still clung to me long after I left it. When I close my eyes, it always takes me back to a smaller house, one that smelled of burnt coffee and cold mornings. I was 8, sitting at a kitchen table that seemed enormous back then. The wallpaper had faded yellow flowers, and the window looked out to a gravel driveway where my parents' car used to be. That morning, the car was gone. No one had told me they were leaving. There was no loud fight, no sound of boxes, no door slamming that could have prepared me. Just a note on the table, the edges curling slightly, and a cup half filled with coffee that had gone gray in the light. I couldn't read the entire note at first. I remember tracing the letters with my finger until they formed words I would never forget. Grandma will take care of you. There was no "we'll be back." No, "I love you." Only a signature, 2 neat names, Peter and Dana Rowe, as if they were signing off on a contract rather than a childhood. I think I stood there for an hour, listening for tires that would never return. When Gloria Rowe arrived later that afternoon, she didn't ask questions. She took one look at me, still wearing the same pajamas, and simply opened her arms. I walked into them because there was nowhere else to go. That was the first time I felt what safety sounded like: silence, steady breathing, and the soft rhythm of her heart against my ear. The farmhouse she brought me to sat on the edge of a wide field in Virginia. The porch creaked when the wind moved through it, and the kitchen was filled with sunlight that fell in wide squares across the floor. The scent of cinnamon and soap lived there permanently, like 2 things refusing to fade. Rosa Delgado, the housekeeper, was already waiting when we arrived, her apron dusted with flour, eyes kind but sharp enough to see everything. I remember how she brushed the dirt from my knees without saying a word. Children know the difference between pity and care. Hers was the second kind. That night they made soup and bread even though I wasn't hungry. Rosa hummed softly as she cleaned up, and Grandma Gloria sat beside me at the table, spooning soup into my bowl until I finally ate. It wasn't the food that filled me, it was the patience. Days turned into months, and the house began to absorb me. The wooden floors no longer felt foreign under my feet. Gloria taught me how to knead dough, measure sugar by instinct, and fix the buttons on a coat instead of buying a new one. She called these small economies, but I think she was teaching me something else, that care is built, not bought. When she worked quietly but fiercely. She managed Rowe Heritage Properties from her study, an empire of rental estates and heritage homes scattered across Virginia. I used to sit under her desk while she made calls, drawing pictures of houses I thought were beautiful. Once, she glanced down and said, "That one looks like a place people could heal in." I didn't know then that she was describing both her business and herself. Rosa became part of that rhythm too. Every morning she opened the curtains before sunrise and whispered a small prayer in Spanish that I never fully understood but always loved hearing. Her presence made the house breathe. I began to learn her quiet strength, the kind that protects without asking for thanks. School came and went. Some teachers pitied me when they realized I lived with my grandmother. Others treated me normally, and that felt like a gift. I learned early to stop explaining why my parents weren't around. People's eyes always softened in a way that made me feel smaller. So I built walls with books instead, reading late at night under the covers while Gloria checked property reports in the next room. Years folded over each other like pages of a journal. At 14, I started helping with estate inspections. Gloria said she wanted me to see what honesty looked like in numbers. She let me review tenant contracts, calculate repair budgets, and organize files. "You need to understand what's yours," she said once. And though her tone was practical, her eyes said something more. "You need to understand what people might take from you." I didn't know then how literal that lesson would become. By 17, I knew the business as well as the back of my hand. Gloria let me sign minor documents under supervision, and Rosa teased that I carried myself like a little CEO. I laughed because it felt absurd, but Gloria only smiled. "It's good to know your worth early," she said, "before someone else tries to price it for you." Sometimes, on quiet evenings, I would ask about Peter and Dana. She never lied, but she never lingered either. "They made choices, sweetheart," she'd say, her voice low but steady. "We can't control who people become, but we can control what we build after they're gone." That sentence became a seed that grew inside me, taking root in places even grief couldn't reach. Her lessons arrived like the smell of bread cooling on a counter, soft, inevitable, essential. She taught me how to face numbers without fear, but also how to face loss without collapsing. The more she shared her world, the smaller my memory of that yellow-flowered kitchen became. Yet trauma never truly disappears. It just finds quieter rooms to hide in. Some nights I'd wake from dreams where the gravel driveway stretched endlessly, and no one came back. Rosa would hear me pacing and bring a blanket to the porch, sitting beside me until dawn. She'd never ask what I dreamed of, and I'd never tell her, because we both already knew. Gloria grew older, but never weaker. Even in her final years, she moved through that house with purpose. She still hosted Sunday dinners, still reminded me to take notes during business meetings, still wore pearls when she signed documents because, as she said, power should never apologize for looking beautiful. I sometimes wonder if she knew her time was short. She began locking her study more often, labeling files meticulously, and leaving handwritten notes on her desk for me to find. Notes about courage, boundaries, and trust. She never once mentioned my parents by name again. Perhaps she believed, as I do now, that absence deserves no audience. The last week of her life, she asked Rosa to polish the brass nameplate on the farmhouse mailbox. When I asked why, she said, "Because names matter when the wrong people start remembering them." I think she always knew they'd come back one day, not out of love, but out of hunger. And that's why she left me not only her fortune, but her strategy. Grief has a sound. For me, it was the quiet ticking of the old clock above her mantel the night she didn't come down for dinner. Everything after that felt rehearsed: the condolences, the funeral, the paperwork. The only thing that didn't feel scripted was the hole she left behind. Now, when I stand in that same farmhouse kitchen, I can still hear Rosa humming, smell cinnamon and soap, and see sunlight cutting the same wide squares across the floor. Everything my parents abandoned, Gloria restored. Everything she built, I now guard. They may have left me once, but she taught me never to leave myself again. If you've ever been left behind and learned to stand anyway, this part was for you. The clock in Martin's office ticked louder than it should have. Maybe it was just my pulse sinking to the rhythm. The air felt heavier, as if the room understood what was about to unfold before I did. The scent of old paper and polished wood filled the space, but underneath it was something sharper, like the faint trace of perfume I didn't recognize, one that didn't belong here. That's when I saw them. Peter Rowe walked in first, tall but smaller than I remembered, the kind of small that comes from regret pretending to be pride. His suit was expensive in a way that didn't quite fit, as if wealth had dressed him but not claimed him. Alina Rowe followed, her face carefully arranged into something that might have passed for sorrow, if not for the faint impatience in her eyes. She still carried herself like someone accustomed to applause. They looked around the office like tourists stepping into a place they thought they owned in another life. It took me a moment to breathe, not because I was overwhelmed, but because I wanted to feel every second of their arrival. I wanted to memorize it: the click of the door, the shift of light across the table, the exact second the ghosts of my childhood turned back into people made of skin and want. Peter's hair was grayer, his posture less certain. Dana's hands were perfectly manicured, a detail that hit me harder than I expected. It meant she had time for vanity, even now. Time to prepare for the show. Martin looked up from his papers, his expression unreadable. I could sense he'd been expecting this. Maybe everyone had, except me. He offered them chairs without ceremony. They sat like actors waiting for a cue that hadn't come yet. I stayed standing. From this angle, I could see my reflection faintly in the glass of the framed certificates behind Martin's desk. My face didn't belong to the child they'd left behind. I had my grandmother's posture now, straight spine, stillness sharpened into control. They glanced at me, quick and assessing. I didn't flinch. There's a certain satisfaction in silence, in letting it stretch until it starts to sound like judgment. I learned that from Gloria. She said quiet people always make the loudest kind of truth. The weight in the room shifted again when Martin closed his file. He didn't need to say anything. The rustle of paper was enough to remind everyone why they were here. I could see the moment comprehension flickered in Peter's eyes. His gaze darted to the stack of documents, each neatly labeled, each bearing my name. His jaw tightened the way people's do when they realize too late that something irreversible has happened. Dana didn't notice at first. She was too busy glancing around, looking for signs of sympathy that weren't coming. I thought about the last time I'd seen them. How their car had disappeared down the driveway, the sky too big, my body too small. How they'd left me with a note and a cup of cooling coffee. And now they were sitting here, legs crossed, rehearsing grief they didn't own. The irony burned quietly inside me. Martin began outlining the terms of the estate, his tone neutral but steady. My inheritance, the assets, the properties, all of it transferred fully to me, as specified in Gloria Rowe's will. His words were precise, unshakable. I watched Peter's throat move as he swallowed, slow and deliberate, like someone trying to digest pride. Dana kept her eyes on the carpet. For a moment, she looked human, small, fragile, but then her shoulders lifted again and the illusion broke. They didn't look at me. Not really. They looked through me, as if I were the obstacle between them and something they believed was rightfully theirs. I almost laughed. Rights are a strange thing when you've already sold them. The silence that followed was the kind that rearranges the air. Martin's pen tapped lightly against the desk once, twice. He reached for a small object beside the folder, the same black recorder I'd seen before. Gloria's recorder. She had planned this, down to the exact second. I could almost hear her voice, calm and deliberate, saying, "If they ever show up, let them hear me instead of you." Martin's hand hovered over the recorder, waiting for my signal. I didn't move. There's a power in waiting, in making someone else wonder what you'll do next. I let the tension bloom. Peter shifted in his seat. Dana crossed her legs the other way. The soft hum of the ceiling vent filled the room. Every sound mattered now. I thought about everything Gloria had built, the empire she'd sustained, the lessons she'd folded into me like ingredients in a recipe for survival. And here were the two people who had discarded me, walking back in as if the years between us could be erased by inheritance law. No apology, no acknowledgement, just the entitlement of those who had learned nothing from loss. I felt the steadiness of my breath return, each inhale deliberate, each exhale clean. The child who waited by the window was gone. The woman standing here owed no one her trembling. When I finally nodded to Martin, the gesture was small but absolute. He pressed the button on the recorder. The soft mechanical click sounded louder than thunder. And then her voice. Gloria Rowe, calme, certaine, éternelle. It filled the room like light through cracked blinds. My heart stuttered once, not from grief but from recognition. She began speaking, her tone careful, her cadence deliberate, the same way she'd spoken when she taught me to bake bread or sign a document. The voice that raised me now rose again, commanding the room even from beyond it. I didn't look at Peter or Dana. I didn't need to. Whatever expression was forming on their faces was irrelevant. This wasn't about revenge. It was about restoration, about balance. Her words rolled on, measured and inescapable. I stood still, hands at my sides, the corners of my vision blurring slightly as the sound anchored me. For the first time in years, I wasn't the abandoned child or the heir to an empire. I was simply the witness of justice being spoken out loud. And that was enough. When the recording paused for breath, I felt my own lungs mirror it, steady and sure. Everything that had been taken from me was already finding its way back, piece by deliberate piece. I didn't smile. I didn't need to. The truth had finally found its volume. If you've ever stood in a room where silence held more power than words, you'll understand this moment. The room felt smaller once her voice was in it. There was a stillness that came over everything, not quiet exactly, but controlled. It wasn't grief. Grief is messy and raw and hungry. This was something else. This was structure. This was order. This was a woman who had known, long before anyone else, exactly how this moment would look. I stood there and listened to my grandmother claim the space the way she always had in life, steady and unapologetic. The recording wasn't a goodbye. it wasn't sentimental. It wasn't her telling me that everything would be all right. She was not the kind of woman who lied to keep people calm. What she left behind was instruction. She laid out facts the way a contractor lays out foundation lines. She stated, in clean terms, that custody of me had not been an accident of circumstance or some emergency favor. It had been a transaction. She documented that Peter Rowe and Dana Rowe had accepted money in exchange for stepping out of my life. She identified the amount, $13,000. Even in the recording, I could hear that number land like metal. She did not soften it. She described them the way you describe parties in a legal agreement, not relatives in a family album. She said they surrendered not just physical custody, but decision-making, guidance, and claim. She said that responsibility for my housing, schooling, medical decisions, and financial security had transferred to her alone, and that they had willingly agreed. She said it clearly, so there would be no room to twist it later into some story of sacrifice. She called it what it was, abandonment for payment. The air changed when those words settled. I felt it in Peter first. His breathing shifted. His shoulders sank. He looked like someone who had just watched his own reflection under courtroom lighting and realized it was unflattering. Dana looked different. She held herself still in an almost frozen way, chin slightly lifted, as if sheer posture could rewrite the record. I remember thinking even then that this moment wasn't about pain. Not my pain, not theirs. It was about jurisdiction. It was about ownership of the narrative. For years, they had owned the version where they were complicated people who had been forced into a hard decision. My grandmother had just taken that version and filed it under fiction. The recording continued. She spoke about me, but not like I was fragile. She spoke about me like I was an asset and an heir, something she had chosen to protect, structure, position. She laid out the chain of training, the years of involvement in Rowe heritage properties, the internal access I had to operations, budgets, property management systems, tenant relations. She made it unambiguous that I was not some unprepared girl floating suddenly into wealth. I was integrated. I was functional. I was expected. In that moment, I realized something I hadn't been ready to name until then. To her, I had never been a backup plan. I had always been the plan. The recording shifted then, from history into warning. That part was for them, but also for me. She anticipated that attempts would be made after her death to interfere with the transfer of assets. She anticipated that there would be claims on emotional grounds, public appeals rooted in the idea of keeping the family legacy stable, efforts to freeze accounts, contest control, stall movement. She called those efforts harassment disguised as concern. Hearing her say it that way even filtered through a small recorder, even across the distance between the living and the gone, hit harder than any comfort speech could have. She knew exactly what they would try. She understood their tactics and had named them without flinching. She had built the defense before they even launched the attack. In a single breath, she did 3 things for me. She validated what had been done to me, she authenticated my right to stand where I stood, and she documented their motives in a way I could carry into any courtroom. That was the moment I understood that the money was not the most valuable thing she left me. The most valuable thing she left me was position. When the recording ended, Martin Hale didn't move at first. He kept his hand near the device like it was evidence on an exhibit table, which in a way, it already was. He had the look of someone who had known all of this for a long time and had simply been waiting for the right time to begin unpacking it. I exhaled, and with that breath came a shift I felt in my body. The weight in my shoulders didn't disappear, but it aligned. Before, I had felt like I was trying to absorb impact. Now I felt braced. Martin opened a folder then. He had brought it in with him, quiet and unassuming, but I hadn't seen what was inside. He set it on the table between us, and I watched his hands as he did it, because hands tell you everything about a moment. There was no shake, no rush. This was not chaos to him. This was procedure. Inside were copies of filings and drafts. I recognized some of the language: injunction language, temporary asset restrictions, emergency relief restraining disbursement. Phrases that mean, in plain terms, lock it all down so she can't touch any of it. He explained, with that same bone-clean tone of his, that counsel hired by Peter and Dana had already prepared an emergency petition. The petition framed them not as people who had relinquished parental rights for cash, but as deeply concerned biological parents who feared that I was handling too much responsibility during a period of distress. The documents framed me as unstable by circumstance. They framed themselves as protectors. They were attempting to freeze the estate. There are moments when anger hits hot. This was not that. This was anger that hit cold. It was the kind of anger that lives in the back teeth, in the spine, in that place behind the ribs where instinct sits. It wasn't rage. Rage is loud. This was refusal. I felt it settle into me, quiet and precise. They weren't just here to watch, or to be seen, or to circle like vultures. They were here with paperwork, with signatures, with strategy. They had hired someone to translate greed into legal phrasing. They weren't treating me like a daughter. They were treating me like an obstacle in a transaction. That was useful. Because you can fight entitlement, but you can destroy strategy. Martin had marked certain sections in the filing with small flags. Those tabs, all neat and color-coded, outlined the argument their attorney planned to use against me. Emotional instability, sudden inheritance, potential mismanagement of a complex portfolio in a moment of vulnerability, concern for the integrity of a multi-generational asset. It was almost perfect, in a way that made me respect the audacity. They had rewritten themselves into guardians. They had rewritten me into liability. But Gloria had anticipated the rewrite and left a counterscript. I understood then why she had recorded those words in that steady, almost clinical tone. It made her sound less like a grieving grandmother, and more like a sworn witness. She wasn't telling a story. She was entering testimony. That was the moment my fear finally cracked. Up until then, there had still been a thin thread in me that ran back to that girl in the kitchen, the one waiting for headlights, the one who still thought maybe. That thread dissolved. It didn't snap. Snapping implies drama and noise. It just quietly, completely, was no longer there. What settled in its place felt sharper. For the first time, I saw Peter and Dana not as people who had hurt me, but as opposing parties. Opposing parties can be handled. Opposing parties can be contained. Opposing parties can be made irrelevant. It felt clean to think of them that way. Clean and honest. I didn't look at them when that realization finished forming. I looked at the folder. I looked at the numbers that were supposed to be mine. I looked at the structure of what they were trying to freeze. And I knew, with a kind of clarity that felt almost physical, that this was not going to end with me begging anyone to see my side. It was going to end with them answering for theirs. There is a point in every story where the center of gravity shifts. For me, it happened in that office, under that light, with that recording still echoing in the air. I stopped feeling like something that could be taken. I started feeling like someone who documents. And once you start documenting, you stop losing. The courthouse air tasted like metal. It sat dry on my tongue, and I could feel it settling into my breathing, into my posture, into the way my jaw refused to unclench. The benches were polished to a dull shine from years of people waiting to be heard. The walls were a tired beige that pretended to be neutral. Nothing about the room was neutral. I sat at the table with Martin Hale to my left. His presence felt like a locked door. He didn't hover, didn't posture, didn't radiate comfort. He just existed in that steady, immovable way that made you understand that nothing would get past him without being named. Across the aisle, Peter Rowe and Dana Rowe had positioned themselves with the kind of careful calculation only desperate people have. Everything about them had been staged. The conservative suits. The composed posture. The way Dana held her hands folded and still in her lap, like someone who had spent an hour practicing how to look gentle. The way Peter kept his eyes low as if sorrow weighed them down. They were not here to make peace. They were here to perform credibility. They had filed to freeze my grandmother's estate and its assets. They had claimed concern. They had filed for temporary protection of what they were calling an unstable transition. They had turned me into the threat in writing. I could feel people in the gallery looking. The courthouse had gathered observers the way thunderstorms gather windows. Curiosity hummed under the surface. People love watching the word family split under pressure. There is a strange kind of humiliation in having your life arranged on paper for strangers to examine. Not the events, but the framing, the suggestion. The way language can be used as a blade and then called caution. The petition their lawyer had filed described Peter and Dana as deeply alarmed relatives stepping in to safeguard a legacy. It described me as a grieving young woman in emotional distress, suddenly in control of a portfolio beyond her ability. It wasn't enough for them to try to take what was mine. They needed to turn me into someone who couldn't be trusted to touch it. The anger that moved through me then wasn't loud, it was clean. I straightened my shoulders and made myself still. I wasn't going to meet anyone's eyes. I wasn't going to react for their benefit. I wasn't going to be the shaking center of their argument. Let them build a narrative around fragility. I refused to supply expressions to match it. This was not about whether I hurt. This was about whether I was allowed to hold. The judge entered with practiced efficiency. No wasted movement, no softness. Authority has a sound when it walks. It changes the way a room settles. My heart climbed into the base of my throat, but I kept my chin level. I watched Peter and Dana when attention shifted toward the bench. Peter adjusted his posture in a way that said he had rehearsed what respectful looked like. Dana lowered her gaze in a way that said she had rehearsed what remorse looked like. Neither one of them looked at me. They didn't need me to exist as a person. They only needed me to exist as a claim. At that point, I understood something important. They were not here to fight me directly. They were here to convince the system to fight me for them. Martin had warned me this part would not be emotional. He said systems do not care how people feel. They care how clean the record looks. They care who documented first. They care which story sounds more prepared. Feelings don't win. Paperwork does. So when he rose, he did not rise like someone grieving a matriarch. He rose like someone submitting evidence. He placed on the table what Gloria had left behind for this exact moment: financial schedules, corporate structure statements from Rowe Heritage Properties, internal audits, medical clarity certifications from her final months, not sentimental notes, documentation. The stack was not dramatic, but it was devastating. I watched the judge scan the first pages. I watched the way her gaze didn't linger on Peter or Dana the way they wanted. She lingered on signatures, on dates, on certifications, on Gloria's language describing her own intent. I realized then how intentional that language had been. My grandmother had spoken in legal muscle long before anyone tried to challenge her. Then came the part that changed the air in the courtroom. Martin presented the transfer agreement that had taken place when I was 8 years old. He did not narrate it with outrage. He did not accuse Peter or Dana of cruelty. He did not describe abandonment in dramatic terms. He let the document stand. Money paid. Custody relinquished. Decision-making surrendered in writing. Rights terminated with full consent. There are truths that collapse an entire performance in one paragraph. I saw Peter's jaw tighten. I saw Dana's shoulders draw in so slightly it would have been invisible to anyone who hadn't studied her body language their entire childhood. They both understood, in that instant, the shape of the room had shifted without their permission. They had walked in as protectors. They now sat as sellers. That turn wasn't loud. It didn't need to be loud. It just needed to be recorded. The judge reviewed the petition they had filed against me and the supporting statements Martin brought in defense of me, then reviewed the language of my grandmother's will. The will had been structured with brutal clarity. Control of assets, control of operations, control of property, all in my name. No shared authority, no family trust, no co-signature, no transitional oversight committee, no backdoor. It hit me while I was sitting there that she hadn't done that to flatter me. She had done it to box them out. This wasn't a gift. It was a perimeter. Martin also presented statements from people who actually knew how Gloria operated in her final stretch. Property managers, accountants, long-term staff. Rosa Delgado had submitted her own written declaration. I had read it the night before, sitting at the farmhouse table where she'd watched me grow up. The handwriting had been steady. The language had been respectful. The loyalty had been unmistakable. To the court, Rosa was house staff with personal observation of daily cognitive function and business engagement. To me, she was the woman who showed up when I couldn't sleep. Both things were true, and for once, both versions served me. The tone in the courtroom changed after that. What had started as an attempt to freeze me out of my own inheritance now looked, on paper, like an attempt to bypass both a no-contact past and a documented transfer of parental rights. The strategy Peter and Dana had brought in. "We're only here to help" sounded different when placed next to evidence that they had been paid to disappear and had stayed gone until money hit the table. There are layers of shame. The surface kind is hot and panicked. The deeper kind is quiet and unfixable. I watched the deeper kind creeping up the back of Peter's neck. But I didn't feel satisfied. I didn't feel vindicated. What I felt was something harder, something closer to obligation. Because in that moment, I understood that if I won here, I wasn't just winning for myself. I was fixing the line. I was setting the official version. I was making sure there would never, in any room that mattered, be a question about who had chosen me and who hadn't. That mattered more than anger. It wasn't about revenge. It was about record. When the review of filings ended, there was no dramatic shift, no slammed hand, no raised voice. The sense I had, sitting there, was more final than that, like a door ceiling, like something being locked in behind glass with a label underneath it for permanent display. I realized the most powerful thing happening in that room was not that I was defending myself. It was that I had stopped asking to be believed. I wasn't pleading that I had been hurt. I was establishing that they had made a transaction and that I was the result. That is a different kind of power. It's colder, it's keter, it lasts longer. By the time we left that courthouse, I no longer saw Peter and Dana as unpredictable. I saw them as predictable forces following predictable incentives. They had revealed process. Process can be mapped. Process can be countered. Process can be dismantled. And once something can be dismantled, it can be ended. The house felt different once I understood it was mine to defend, not mine to mourn. Morning light moved over the long farmhouse table, across the old wood grain marked by years of use. I stood at the head of it with papers spread in a grid that had started as chaos and turned into structure. Floor plans, deed copies, insurance summaries, operating statements for Rowe Heritage Properties, contact logs from staff, notes in my own handwriting. This wasn't grief work anymore. This was containment. I made myself look at reality without soft edges. Vulnerabilities first. That was the rule now. The first vulnerability was obvious. Her name was Rosa Delgado. On paper, Rosa was household staff. In truth, she had been the constant presence in this house for most of my remembered life. That made her a direct line of attack. If Peter and Dana couldn't get to me cleanly, they might try to get to me by tearing at the people around me. They had already tried to build themselves into concerned guardians. The next escalation would be to paint everyone loyal to me as manipulative, self-interested, or exerting pressure. I could see that play forming. I could feel it. So I wrote her name at the top of a yellow legal sheet and started listing protections. Housing security, healthcare coverage, counsel availability, emergency contact chain, documentation of her role as witness, not influencer. I didn't like writing the word witness next to her name. It felt cold, but cold was what the situation demanded. If the narrative ever tried to twist Rosa into some scheming caretaker who got in my ear, I needed already signed statements that defined her correctly. Supporting presence, consistent observer, credible professional. I had never thought of Rosa as someone I might have to defend in writing. Now I understood that protecting her on paper was an act of care as real as anything else. The second vulnerability lived in reputation. My grandmother's company carried weight in this town, and weight draws pressure. Rowe Heritage Properties looked stable to most people from the outside because all they saw were clean buildings and predictable tenants. But from the inside, I could already feel where rumors could loosen bolts. It wouldn't take much for competitors or opportunists to start whispering that the company was unsteady. That was all it ever takes. One whisper that leadership is fragile, one whisper that legal ownership is in dispute, and suddenly vendors get nervous, lenders get quiet, and numbers start to move in the wrong direction. So I made another list. This one wasn't about care, it was about perception. Public message plan, spokesperson control, written internal memo on continuity, consistency of language. I hated that I even had to think like that, but it would be reckless not to. Peter and Dana had already tried to weaponize presentation in court and on paper. The next predictable step would be to lean into public performance. They could go stand in front of someone's camera and present themselves as the stable choice. The rightful guardians of the family brand, worried sick about assets being mishandled by someone too close to it emotionally. I could almost hear it. If they did that and I stayed silent, silence would not be read as strength. It would be read as confirmation. That's how public fear works in this country. The most practiced storyteller in the room gets to be called the truth unless you counter at the same speed, with cleaner structure. So I drafted language. Not pleading. Not dramatic. Professional tone. Controlled tone. I refused to perform unsteady for an audience that wanted to be entertained by it. The third vulnerability sat inside the business itself. I knew the properties. I knew most of the tenants by face and by habit. I knew which roofs needed work soon and which leases were due for negotiation. What I did not fully know yet were the internal weak points that someone from the outside could try to pry apart. Supplier contracts, insurance gaps, lines of credit. Long-standing arrangements that had been running on handshake loyalty rather than formal renewal. Those weak points become leverage fast if someone ambitious gets access to them. I marked those in red. This is where Martin Hale came in. Martin had always felt like a wall in court. Here, at my table, he functioned more like a scalpel. He did not speak to me like a child inheriting something. He did not warn me that this would be a lot. He treated me, simply and directly, like the person in charge of an active problem. He outlined the concrete structures that were already in motion because of my grandmother. Litigation reserve funds segregated from operating cash. A clause in the will that redirected legal costs onto any party who challenged distribution and failed. a separate holding entity meant to isolate the core properties from any reckless emergency claims. He even showed me a draft of an internal directive Gloria had written and signed before she passed, documenting that I had been directly trained in operations decisions for years. That document hit me in a way I didn't expect. It wasn't affectionate, it wasn't flowery, it didn't praise my character. It confirmed my direct engagement with budgets, leases, and maintenance approval. It existed to prove competence. And in this country, competence is a weapon. It occurred to me that Gloria had not just left me assets. She had left me admissible proof that I wasn't some impulsive heir. That was strategic love. The more I absorbed, the more something in me continued to harden into shape. This was not about keeping what I deserved. That word felt useless now. This was about maintaining structural control over what was already mine legally, financially, and practically, and making sure that any threat to that control was caught, logged, traced, and answered. It started to feel less like grief and more like building a response protocol. I saw the path forward clearly. I would not wait for Peter and Dana to appear in driveways or offices or lobbies. I would not sit by a window like a child waiting for headlights. That version of me had already died quietly in a courthouse. I would move first. The first move would be formal notice. Not emotional confrontation, not begging them to understand what they did to me, not demanding apologies they had no intention of giving, a written notice, a hard boundary. A legal instruction drafted with Martin's oversight and delivered in a way that could be documented. The notice would establish that any further attempt to interfere with company operations, contact staff, approach vendors, speak to tenants, or misrepresent themselves as acting in the interest of the company would be treated as harassment with consequences. It felt almost cold, thinking of them that way not as my parents, but as named external risk. But cold thinking was clean thinking. Cold thinking was safe thinking. The second move would be internal lockdown. Access points would close. Files that had been casually accessible in the house would be relocated to secure storage. Keys would be reassigned. Vendor calls would be logged. Staff would be instructed, in writing, what to do if approached. Not, if you see anything strange, let me know, because vague instructions become missed instructions. Clear protocol, exact steps. Who to contact, where to document, what phrases to avoid. The kind of procedure you put in place when you understand you are being targeted on purpose. I understood, finally, what power looked like outside of fantasy. It wasn't dramatic revenge. It wasn't screaming and breaking things and telling them they ruined my life. Power looked like calm process that made it impossible for them to touch anything that mattered without tripping alarms. The third move would be future-proofing. I didn't just want protection. I wanted legacy. Clean legacy. I wanted to build something that could not be rewritten when I wasn't in the room to defend it. Not just money, record. So I started sketching the outline of something I had never considered before that day. A foundation. I didn't know what to call it yet, but I knew exactly what it would do. It would exist to protect people who had been discarded by blood and then hunted later when money became convenient. It would provide counsel, documentation support, stabilization money, and housing security. It would tell a person in my position, you are not crazy, you are not ungrateful, you are not dramatic, you are being targeted, and here is a system designed for exactly that. That thought lit something alive in me. The bitterness I had carried for so long didn't vanish. It changed temperature. It moved from poison to fuel. I realized I didn't want to spend the rest of my life obsessing over what Peter and Dana had done. I wanted to make sure no version of them ever succeeded again, with anyone. That, finally, felt like clarity. I do not owe reconciliation. I do not owe access. I do not owe a seat at any table I run. I am not obligated to reopen doors for the same hands that closed them on me. I owe protection to the people who actually showed up. And that is what I am going to build. The morning arrived without announcement. It wasn't softer or brighter than the days before. It simply arrived, as all endings do. The sky over the hills was the same color as the linen curtains in the study, gray enough to make you forget there was once blue underneath. I stood at the window of my grandmother's house, though by law and effort it was now mine. The silence no longer felt like emptiness. It felt like a clean surface after a storm. Every trace of chaos had been documented, contained, and archived. Every move my parents could make was already accounted for. Still, something in me resisted calling it victory. Winning and healing are not the same thing. The first belongs to systems, the second belongs to silence. Martin Hale's work was finished. The court had affirmed the estate, dismissed their appeals, and enforced cost penalties that would dismantle what little wealth Peter and Dana had left. Their house, once the stage of their pride, was listed for sale within a week. They hadn't called again. They couldn't. The legal notice was clear. Contact of any kind would be treated as harassment. I hadn't seen them since that day in the courthouse. I didn't want to. Their faces had already become more memory than flesh. They had turned into an idea, a warning of what love without conscience looks like when it ages. Rosa had suggested burning the old family photographs. I didn't. I locked them away instead, not to honor the people in them, but to remind myself what damage looks like when it smiles for the camera. The house around me no longer felt like a museum of grief. It had become an operating system: quiet efficiency, clean surfaces, clear function. Gloria's handwriting still marked some of the folders in the office, small annotations, half notes, reminders of intention. She had always written like someone preparing to be misunderstood. Sometimes I caught myself tracing the lines of her letters. They felt like braille messages from the dead, small certainties pressed into paper. I thought often about what she must have known. Maybe she had seen the fracture forming in her son long before I ever did. Maybe she had understood that the child she raised would never be the father he was supposed to become. And maybe she built her empire not for herself, but as a safeguard against the day when blood turned to threat. That kind of foresight doesn't come from fear. It comes from survival learned the hard way. And now that survival belonged to me. When the final legal confirmation came through, I sat alone in her chair and read the letter out loud, not for ceremony, but to test how her name sounded next to mine. The sound was steady. Not perfect, but aligned. Ownership didn't feel like possession. It felt like responsibility measured in weight and signatures. Every property, every employee, every clause was a continuation of her logic. What she had built to protect herself now existed to protect me. For the first time, I wasn't haunted by what they took. I was anchored by what she left. I understood that revenge had never really been the point. It wasn't about destroying Peter and Dana. They were already destroying themselves long before they showed up in that lawyer's office. My task had been simpler: to make sure their collapse didn't take me down with them. Gloria used to say, "You don't outrun rot, you isolate it." And that's what I had done. Isolation is not cruelty when it's the only thing that keeps you whole. The following weeks moved quietly. I completed the paperwork for the foundation I'd been drafting. It now had a name: the Lumen Trust. I liked the word lumen, light measured by the space it reaches, not the flame that makes it. That was what I wanted for the people it would serve. Not spectacle, but reach. The trust would exist for anyone who had been cut out by blood and cornered by legality. I wanted it to provide structure for those who had been made invisible inside their own families. Proof, funding, counsel. Systems that don't depend on sympathy, because sympathy dies faster than memory. Rosa helped with the logistics. Her calm precision had become the pulse of the house. She never asked about Peter or Dana again. She didn't have to. Some stories finish themselves once you stop feeding them. At night, I walked through the garden Gloria had once tended. The soil smelled like wet iron and cedar. The vines she planted years ago had outgrown their frames, curling toward the sky like something that refused to obey instruction. I left them that way. Control isn't the same as strangling. I didn't pray. I didn't ask for signs. But I did speak, sometimes not to ghosts, just to memory. I told her I'd kept everything she built intact. I told her the locks were changed, the papers filed, the accounts moved, the enemies neutralized. I told her the child she had once found shaking by the window had finally stopped waiting for headlights. And in that stillness, I realized something quiet and dangerous. I didn't need forgiveness. Not from them, not even from her. Because forgiveness implies debt, and I had already paid mine with silence, stability, and structure. What I needed now wasn't closure, it was direction. So I wrote one more document that night, a personal one, not legal, not public. It was titled, "For the Next Girl Who Thinks She Owes Them." It wasn't a letter of comfort, it was a blueprint. A set of steps, strategies, and psychological notes on how to survive betrayal without letting it become your identity. I sealed it in an envelope and placed it in the same drawer where Gloria had kept her will. Maybe one day someone would find it when they needed it most. Maybe that would be enough of a legacy. Because sometimes legacy isn't wealth or memory, it's warning. By morning, the first donation for the trust had cleared. It came from a woman in another state, someone I'd never met. The note attached read simply, "I heard your story. Thank you for making space for ours." I didn't cry. I just felt the world shift slightly toward equilibrium. When I stepped outside, the air was sharp but forgiving. The sky had finally turned the color of truth uncomfortable, undeniable, open. That was when I understood that revenge isn't about hurting back. It's about rewriting the narrative so you are no longer the one being defined by what was done to you. And in that rewrite, I no longer existed as an abandoned child or an heir. I existed as proof. Proof that survival, when refined by purpose, becomes justice. Every story ends where its silence begins. Mine began the day I stopped waiting to be understood and started documenting everything. Power, I learned, isn't loud, it's precise. If you ever find yourself at the edge of someone else's ruin, remember this distance is not cruelty. It's how you stay alive long enough to build something better. Now tell me, if your past showed up at your door tomorrow, would you open it? Or would you finally build a lock that fits only your hands? I want to know how far this story has traveled, and how many of us have chosen survival over sentiment.